Empires do not fall in a single night. They fall in a series of ultimatums that nobody believes anymore. And on that Tuesday in April 2026, day 39 of what had already become the most consequential military confrontation since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the world was staring at yet another American ultimatum aimed at the Islamic Republic of Iran and asking itself a question that no Pentagon briefing could answer. Was this the one that mattered, or just another line drawn in sand that the tide was about to wash away? Because what was unfolding was not simply a war. It was the architecture of the post 1945 global order cracking in real time, live streamed between missile launches and Truth Social posts. The deadline was 8 p.m. Eastern Time, Tuesday, April 7th. President Donald Trump had declared that if Iran did not fully reopen the Strait of Hormuz by that hour, every bridge, every power plant, every piece of critical infrastructure in the country would face what he called complete demolition. He had warned that a whole civilization could be removed from the scene in a single night. The language was not metaphorical. U.S. Central Command had already struck more than 13,000 targets across Iran in 38 days. Israel had simultaneously hit railways, petrochemical plants, and intelligence headquarters. And Iran, defiant, battered, but far from subdued, had fired back at Israel, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, and the UAE, closed the most important energy choke point on the planet, and watched the global economy tremble. To understand what that Tuesday night meant, you had to rewind. Not days, centuries. The Strait of Hormuz was never simply a waterway. It was the jugular vein of the petroleum age. 20% of the world's seaborne oil passed through those 34 kilometers of water in peacetime. The struggle over who controlled that passage traced a line back to the Portuguese who seized Hormuz Island in 1507, through the British Empire's Gulf protectorates, the tanker war of the 1980s, all the way to the moment an American president threatened to erase a nation if it did not open a shipping lane. The geography was Mackinder made flesh. The Gulf was the energy corridor that powered whoever held the Eurasian heartland. And in 2026, the contest for that corridor had drawn in every major power. The United States fighting to preserve the dollar-denominated energy order, China quietly stockpiling 104 days of strategic oil reserves and watching American carrier groups operate under fire, Russia enjoying a petroleum windfall that rescued its war budget in Ukraine, and the Gulf monarchies trapped between Iranian missiles overhead and American bases on their soil. This was not a new contest. It was the oldest contest on earth wearing new clothes. When the Abbasid caliphs built Baghdad as the center of a trade network stretching from Canton to Cordoba, they understood that whoever controlled the maritime passage between the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean controlled the flow of silk, spices, and silver, the hydrocarbons of their era. When the British drew their invisible lines across the Gulf in the 19th century, they were not interested in sand. They were interested in the route to India, and later, in the black liquid beneath the sand that would fuel an empire of machines. And when the United States inherited Britain's Gulf security architecture after 1945, it married that geographic leverage to a monetary system. Oil would be priced in dollars, recycled through Wall Street, and protected by the Fifth Fleet. The petrodollar order was born. And it held through the 1973 embargo, through the Iran-Iraq war, through Desert Storm, through the invasion of Iraq, because no one had ever called the bluff until now. Now we are getting to the most surprising part of this story. The war itself, Operation Epic Fury, was born not from a sudden crisis, but from the collapse of a diplomatic process that had been on the verge of success. In late February, Omani Foreign Minister Badr bin Hamad al-Busaidi had publicly declared that a nuclear agreement between Washington and Tehran was within reach. Iran had agreed to dramatically dilute its enriched uranium stockpile. Technical teams were scheduled to meet in Vienna. And then, on February 28th, the United States and Israel launched coordinated surprise strikes. The war that nobody was supposed to want had begun in the middle of the negotiations designed to prevent it. Oman's foreign minister would later write that the United States had lost control of its own foreign policy, a diplomatic grenade that landed squarely on the credibility of the entire Western security architecture. Iran's response followed a logic that military strategists had predicted but rarely seen at this scale. Unable to match American firepower conventionally, Tehran activated its asymmetric doctrine. The Revolutionary Guard closed the Strait of Hormuz using naval mines, coastal missile batteries, drone swarms, and the sheer geography of a waterway where Iran's coastline dominated the northern shore. Some vessels from friendly nations were allowed through, Turkish-flagged ships among them. But for the global energy market, the effect was catastrophic. Brent crude surged past $126 per barrel. The IEA described it as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Gulf oil production dropped by at least 10 million barrels per day. Qatar declared force majeure on all LNG exports after Iranian drones struck facilities at the South Pars complex. Kuwait's airport was shuttered and its tanker fleet immobilized. And the detail nobody talks about, but that decides the game, is this: the crisis extended far beyond oil. 30% of internationally traded fertilizers transited Hormuz. Global fertilizer prices surged 20%. The Philippines became the first country to declare a national energy emergency linked to a foreign conflict. Bangladesh cut office hours and forced shops to close by evening. Australia's Prime Minister urged citizens to take public transport to preserve fuel for farmers. The war in the Gulf had become a global supply chain earthquake, its aftershocks reaching rice paddies in Southeast Asia and wheat fields in South America. Against this backdrop, three scenarios were playing out simultaneously in the corridors of power: in the White House Situation Room, in Tehran's underground command bunkers, and in the calculating capitals of Moscow and Beijing. Scenario one was total infrastructure annihilation, the option Trump publicly telegraphed: every bridge, every power plant, 4 hours. B-52 bombers had already begun flying over Iranian territory. Karg Island, through which 90% of Iran's oil exports flowed, was struck before the deadline. Israel hit railways and the Sharif University campus in Tehran. But here was the problem: bombing infrastructure into rubble had never historically produced surrender. NATO's 78-day campaign over Serbia in 1999 failed to dislodge a single soldier through air power alone. Israel's 2006 Lebanon war ended with Hezbollah politically strengthened. The 1991 Gulf War destroyed Iraq's infrastructure, and Saddam remained for 12 more years. Iran's commanders had studied this history obsessively, and the full infrastructure campaign carried a risk even Trump's advisors understood. Eliminating power generation across a nation of 90 million people would create a humanitarian catastrophe that made the war politically unsustainable in every allied capital. There was another dimension that mainstream discourse missed. Iran had not simply been absorbing strikes, it had been retaliating with surprising precision. Ballistic missiles struck residential buildings in Haifa. Drones hit landmarks in Dubai, Manama, and Doha. Saudi Arabia's eastern oil facilities suffered damage. The King Fahd Bridge between Saudi Arabia and Bahrain was shut. The UAE recalled its ambassador to Israel, a dramatic signal from an Abraham Accords signatory. And this retaliatory capacity was not Iranian technology alone. Western intelligence confirmed that Russia was providing Tehran with satellite imagery and targeting data for American warships, a real-time intelligence pipeline giving Iran's Revolutionary Guard a precision capability it could not have achieved independently. Now we are getting to the most surprising part of this story. The Russian intelligence pipeline represented a new kind of warfare, what analysts called the War of Signals. Russia's Canopus V satellite, rebranded Kayam for Iranian operational use, provided round-the-clock imagery of the Gulf theater. Chinese-manufactured YLC-8B counter-stealth radar systems had degraded American stealth operations. Iran was nearing a deal to acquire 50 CM-302 supersonic anti-ship missiles. China's Mach 3 sea skimming variant that military analysts called carrier removers. The USS Abraham Lincoln and USS Gerald Ford were operating within their engagement envelope. The half century of uncontested American technological dominance in the Gulf was being eroded quietly, deliberately, by years of Chinese hardware transfers and Russian intelligence sharing. Scenario 2, the diplomatic off ramp, was the most fragile and most consequential possibility. Pakistan, Egypt, and Turkey had formed a trilateral mediation channel. A 45-day ceasefire proposal was drafted, under which Iran would discuss reopening the strait in exchange for a guaranteed permanent end to hostilities. Iran rejected this, but the rejection was a negotiating position, not a door slam. Tehran's 10-point counterproposal demanded a complete cessation of hostilities with non-repetition guarantees, the lifting of sanctions, an end to Israeli operations against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and, in a clause that made energy traders choke, a new Hormuz transit regime with a $2 million fee per vessel. It was maximalist. But it was also a signal that Tehran was not seeking to close the strait forever. It was seeking to monetize its geographic leverage. Trump had acknowledged the significance, calling the Iranian proposal a significant step, while immediately adding it was not good enough. His envoy, Steve Witkoff, was seated in the White House briefing room as Trump spoke, a silent signal that negotiations were more alive than the rhetoric suggested. Foreign policy expert Trita Parsi noted that Trump could again extend the deadline, having already done so multiple times, from March 23rd to March 26th to April 6th to April 7th. The pattern was unmistakable. The deadlines were not military triggers. They were negotiating pressure valves, urgency without irreversibility. The real breaking point starts right here. Scenario 3, the one that the most sophisticated geopolitical minds tracked with greatest anxiety, was about what happened in the spaces between Washington and Tehran, the silent recalibration of global power the war had already set in motion, regardless of its outcome. Start with Russia. Before the crisis, Moscow's energy revenues were in freefall. Oil earnings had dropped below $10 billion in February. The Kremlin was preparing sweeping budget cuts. Then Hormuz closed and everything changed. Russia stood to gain between $45 and $151 billion in additional revenues in 2026. Russian crude's discount narrowed as buyers scrambled for any available barrel. Trump's own decision to ease certain Russian oil sanctions, framed as market stabilization, enabled Moscow to fund its Ukraine operations with windfall profits from America's Gulf War. Putin did not need to fire a single missile. He needed only to wait and sell. China's calculation was more layered. 45% of its oil imports transited Hormuz, and price spikes threatened its fragile recovery. But strategic benefits accumulated faster than costs. Beijing had built reserves to 104 days of import coverage. It was watching how American carrier strike groups performed under real combat, recording every engagement for future Taiwan Strait doctrine. And most consequentially, the war was accelerating the geopolitical alignment American strategy had spent half a century preventing. The consolidation of a Russia-China partnership anchored in energy, interdependence, defense cooperation, and commitment to what both called a multipolar order. The irony was suffocating. The 2017 U.S. National Security Strategy had identified China and Russia as distinct revisionist powers requiring separate management. The Kissinger Doctrine rested on one principle: never allow Moscow and Beijing to form a durable alliance. And here was the United States fighting a Middle Eastern war that simultaneously enriched Russia, educated China, and drove both closer together than at any point since the Sino-Soviet alignment of the 1950s. Now we are getting to the most surprising part of this story. The Gulf monarchies were undergoing their own tectonic reassessment. Saudi Arabia possessed extraordinary, uncomfortable leverage. Its east-west pipeline to the Red Sea port of Yanbu was the only route bypassing Hormuz, carrying 7 million barrels daily, essentially single-handedly preventing global oil market collapse. But if Riyadh joined the war, Tehran would target the pipeline, and Houthi forces would strike Saudi Red Sea ports, sealing off the last Gulf export route. The global economy would not stumble, it would crater. The wreckage of the 2023 China brokered Saudi Iranian detente complicated everything further. Iranian missiles had struck Riyadh. But strategic minds in the kingdom understood that destroying Iran would create a failed state of 90 million people across the Gulf, with all the militia fragmentation and ungoverned territory that entailed. The UAE had made its own dramatic move. By recalling its ambassador to Israel, Abu Dhabi signaled that Gulf tolerance for collateral damage had hit its limit. Iranian drones struck near Dubai International Airport. Amazon data centers were targeted, a strike aimed directly at the Emirates' post-oil economic model. You could not sell yourself as the Singapore of the Middle East while missiles were cratering your server farms. And the detail nobody talks about, but that decides the game, is this. The humanitarian dimension was approaching a threshold no military success could offset. Over 80% of GCC caloric intake was imported through Hormuz. 70% of the region's food imports were disrupted. Kuwait and Qatar, where desalination provided 99% of drinking water, faced potential water shortages. Iranian officials had called on young people to form human chains around power plants. Any American strike on a plant surrounded by civilian shields would become the war's defining image, replayed from Jakarta to Johannesburg. Europe added another layer of consequence that illuminated the continent's structural dependency. This was the second energy crisis in 4 years, the first triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the second by the Hormuz closure. Gas storage stood at a dangerously low 30% after the harsh 2025-2026 winter. Dutch TTF gas benchmarks nearly doubled. The European Central Bank postponed planned interest rate reductions and revised its inflation forecasts upward. Italian airports in Bologna, Milan, Treviso, and Venice imposed jet fuel restrictions. Ryanair's CEO predicted summer flight cancellations of 5 to 10%, warning that the United Kingdom was the most vulnerable European nation due to its reliance on Kuwaiti market share. Jet fuel prices in the United States had surged 95% since the war began. The diesel shortage, diesel being the fuel that powered every truck, every train, every industrial furnace across the continent, was heading toward crisis levels that threatened to tip energy-intensive economies into recession. Chemical manufacturers slapped surcharges of up to 30% on their products. As one European official reportedly said, in a line that captured the continent's exhaustion with being perpetually caught between other people's conflicts. Different conflict. Same European divisions, same energy dilemmas. The continent that had spent 4 years trying to wean itself off Russian gas dependency had simply traded one vulnerability for another. And the lesson, if there was one, was that energy security could not be achieved through supplier diversification alone. It required something far more fundamental, a rethinking of the entire model. The Global South bore the heaviest burden with the least responsibility. Thailand saw diesel prices nearly double in a matter of weeks. Singapore, the refining hub of Asia, watched as crude inputs dwindled and its refineries, which processed up to 1.5 million barrels per day, scrambled for alternative sources. Japan, which received 70% of its Middle Eastern oil through Hormuz, activated emergency measures. India, a nation of 1.4 billion people with a voracious appetite for energy imports, found itself conducting a diplomatic ballet between condemning the strikes and maintaining its relationships with all parties, including its newly complicated Chabahar port arrangement on Iran's southeastern coast. The war was a reminder that in the modern global economy, there were no neutral bystanders. There were only degrees of exposure. The real breaking point starts right here. What the three scenarios ultimately revealed was not a question about Iran. It was a question about the nature of American power. Could the United States still bend a regional adversary through kinetic force, as it had in Iraq, Serbia, and Libya? Or had the interconnection of the global economy, the proliferation of precision strike technology, and the rise of alternative power centers created a world where overwhelming firepower no longer produced intended results? 38 days of evidence pointed overwhelmingly toward the second conclusion. The U.S. had achieved air supremacy. It had eliminated key commanders. It had struck 13,000 targets. Yet, Hormuz remained closed. Oil stayed above $110. America's Gulf allies were furious and hedging. Russia was richer. China was learning. Europe was rationing. The global south was suffering and watching the dollar order reveal its ultimate vulnerability. Trump's pattern of deadline extensions told its own story. Each was accompanied by escalated rhetoric and actual strikes, creating a ratchet that narrowed diplomatic space without achieving stated objectives. Iran's foreign ministry captured Tehran's read. Americans had been trying to intimidate Iranians with such literature for 48 years. Meanwhile, Iran's foreign minister had been on the phone for 72 hours straight with counterparts from India, Russia, Turkey, Japan, Qatar, France, Egypt, and Pakistan. A contact list revealing this was not a bilateral crisis requiring a bilateral solution, it was a systemic rupture. Pakistan's mediation role illuminated a shift Western media consistently underestimated: the rise of non-Western diplomatic agency. Islamabad mediated not because Washington asked, but because Hormuz threatened Pakistan's energy security directly. The country relied on imports for the vast majority of its fuel, and because Pakistan possessed unique leverage as a nuclear-armed Muslim-majority state, with military ties to Saudi Arabia, economic ties to China, and a long border with Iran. Turkey occupied a similar position. NATO member, regional power, and a nation whose ships were among the very few allowed through the Iranian blockade. Ankara's transport minister confirmed that a third Turkish-flagged vessel had transited Hormuz, a detail that carried more geopolitical weight than any Security Council resolution, because it demonstrated that Iran's closure was selective, not absolute. Tehran was not trying to shut down global trade. It was trying to control it. Egypt, meanwhile, brought its own considerable diplomatic weight to the table, with Cairo's proximity to the Suez Canal, the other great maritime choke point, giving it a unique perspective on the geopolitics of waterway control. The trilateral mediation corridor of Pakistan, Turkey, and Egypt was itself a statement about the new geography of diplomacy. The most active peacemakers were not Western capitals, but nations straddling the fault lines of the old and new orders. Iran's 10-point counter-proposal, examined closely, was not the document of a government seeking permanent war. Yield, the $2 million transit fee, the clause drawing the most derision, was also an acknowledgement that Iran was willing to reopen the strait. The question was the price. In geopolitics, as in real estate, when both sides discuss price, they are no longer discussing whether a deal will happen. They are discussing what it will cost. And so, the deeper question, the one that would outlast the deadline, the war, and whatever emerged from that Tuesday night, was not whether Hormuz would reopen. It would. Markets demanded it. The caloric survival of entire populations demanded it. The question was what the reopening would reveal about the distribution of power in the world that emerged. Because the old order, American military supremacy, dollar hegemony, free Gulf energy flow guaranteed by the US Navy, had not survived this war intact. The moment Iran demonstrated that a determined regional power could close Hormuz for over a month, absorb 13,000 strikes, and still negotiate from leverage, the credibility of the entire security architecture was permanently altered. Every nation dependent on Gulf energy, Japan, Germany, India, Brazil, now incorporated a variable that had previously been theoretical. What happens when the strait actually closes? The answer: everything stops. Refineries in Singapore ran dry. Airports in Italy rationed fuel. Farmers in Bangladesh could not afford fertilizer. The global economy, for all its digital sophistication, rested on the same ancient foundation: the physical movement of hydrocarbons through a narrow body of water between Iran and Oman. And the nation controlling the northern shore had just proved that this physical reality trumped every aircraft carrier, every sanctions regime, and every presidential social media post. Russia and China understood this with a clarity Washington seemed to lack. Moscow's strategy, silence plus oil sales, was Sun Tzu in practice, winning without fighting. China maintained its ceasefire call while radar systems and missile technology continued flowing to Iran. And its 2026-2030 five-year plan contained accelerated provisions for the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, a project that would eventually allow China to source gas from Russia overland, reducing Hormuz dependence permanently. The Belt and Road Initiative was always partly about creating corridors bypassing US patrolled choke points. The Iran war had just provided the most compelling argument imaginable for why those corridors were survival necessities, not luxuries. As the clock ticked toward 8 p.m. Eastern, the three scenarios were not mutually exclusive. Trump could order strikes while extending the diplomatic window. Iran could absorb punishment while maintaining its Hormuz grip. Russia and China could profit while doing nothing. The Gulf monarchies could intercept missiles while privately begging both sides to stop. What was undeniably clear, made material by 39 days of war, a million stranded barrels, and a global economy groaning under its own fragility, was that the unipolar moment was finished. Not as academic theory or BRICS summit rhetoric, but as lived reality experienced by every person who tried to fill a gas tank, buy fertilizer, or board a flight in the past 5 weeks. The deadline would come. The deadline would pass. The war would continue, pause, or escalate into something more terrible. But the world that emerged from this crucible would not be the world that entered it. The only open question, the one that would define the next quarter century, was who would build the architecture of what came next. Washington, which had demonstrated both overwhelming military capacity and strategic incoherence. Beijing, which had mastered strategic patience. Moscow, which had turned someone else's war into financial resurrection. Riyadh, Ankara, Islamabad, or New Delhi, regional powers that had discovered they could no longer outsource their security, or all of them at once, in a messy, contested, multipolar negotiation that would make the Congress of Vienna look like a dinner party, and somewhere in the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow passage where the petroleum age had been built and where it was now being unmade, the water was dark and still and waiting.